Hi, it's Penny here, and today we're going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in the month of March, which was 14 books. As usual, I'm going to do this book battle style, which means I pair up all the books and I battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month. We're going to start first with a DNF battle, and actually neither of these are going to go forward to the best book of the month because I DNF them. Clearly, it's not going to happen. So we've got The Bone People by Keri Hulme up against Artemis by Andy Weir. Both of these were books that I had on my actual physical TBR shelves, but they worked out to be disappointing. The Bone People is kind of a New Zealand classic by a part Maori author. We're following basically this strange woman who lives in a tower by the beach, and then this young mute child turns up on her doorstep one day, and it's about the relationship that she forms with him and also his adoptive father. And the writing style is very strange. It kind of slips between third person and these little indented paragraphs of different characters' thoughts, and it's not always clear like whose thoughts you're getting. Sometimes it feels almost poetical, but other times I still felt it was a bit clunky. But the thing that really led me to DNF this is it seems like a core theme in this is child abuse. So it turns out that the father is abusing this young child, and I just hated everything about the way that was being dealt with. I gave up about 50% through when we got the internal monologue of the father feeling guilty about this abuse while he masturbated. I just didn't appreciate the way anything was being dealt with. Admittedly, this is a book from the early 80s, so that might have been the problem, but I just didn't want to read any more of it. Then I picked up Artemis by Andy Weir. I did really like The Martian and also Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I will admit, at the time I didn't think I liked Project Hail Mary as much, but it has stuck with me longer than The Martian. But I think the reason I liked both those books is because you have this really likable character with a really important problem that they're solving, and you kind of get to follow along with their problem solving process, which I found really addictive in those first two books. This one though, we're following this woman named Jazz who lives on the moon in this moon colony, but she's very poor compared to a lot of people who live on the moon, and she's running kind of this underground smuggling scam. Basically, she's a criminal trying to get ahead, trying to make some money. She gets hired to do this one particular crime, and that's the problem that she's solving. But unlike the first one, so not only is she not a likable character, and possibly not a very realistic character, because it also feels like in The Martian, in Project Hail Mary, Andy Weir's writing a character that's maybe very similar to him. This is a woman who's a person of colour, and I just don't think Andy Weir has the awareness to write that character in a way that feels genuine. So it's a character lacking genuineness and likableness, and she's not really taking you along on her problem-solving journey. Instead, it's that situation where you're seeing what she's doing, and like after the fact, she's like, see, I had a plan all along. And I hate books where the author's like, oh, she had a plan all along. And I also didn't think a lot of the things she was doing would even stand up to realism, even though the science was still there, I guess. Anyway, the summary is I gave up on this one. I don't really know what it was that made me give up on it. Mainly, I think I just got bored and couldn't be bothered going back to it. But if I was putting these two books up against each other, I think like the one I'm more likely to go back to would be Artemis, because at least it didn't have painful child abuse to read. So I could see myself finishing this if I was in a different mood on a different day, but I also just don't see myself ever loving this. Okay, then on to books that maybe have a chance of winning Best Book of the Month. We have Witch King by Martha Wells up against The Olympian Affair by Jim Butcher. So Witch King follows a demon who wakes up and discovers that his previous body has been killed, and now he's in a new body, and he kind of has to figure out who killed him, and there's kind of like a big investigation or a big suspicion that someone might have betrayed him. It's also told in two timelines, so that's the present, and then the past is about him initially getting his first body in this world where there's kind of like these people who have a deal with the demons where when one of them is about to die, the demon will take over the body and get all the memories of that person and then continue in that person's body, like living forever. And there's also this other very powerful race of people who's kind of coming in and conquering the whole world and causing a lot of problems. So the world is really interesting, the magic is really interesting, but the way the story is written is kind of terrible. The past story was much more interesting, but to get interested in the present story, I really think you already need to have read the whole past story. Lucky for me, I started this in audiobook, and then once I got 60% of the way through, decided the audiobook was terrible and went back to the beginning and read the book again via ebook, which was a lot better because I knew the stuff that was going to happen in the past, which is important, I think, to be engaged in the present. But there's kind of this core group of characters that the demon is working with, and I think you're meant to feel that they have a really strong connection, but the way the book is structured, I just don't think it comes across. And again, the way that it's written, I think just kind of means that you end up confused for most of the book. So I feel like this had a lot of potential, but again, the way it was written just meant it didn't live up to that. Then we have The Olympian Affair by Jim Butcher. So this is the second book in the Cinder Spires series, which the first book was The Aeronaut's Windlass. I was really interested in this series mainly because the etherealists who do the magic in this world seemed really interesting. They're really eccentric because of the mental strain of doing magic in this world, and I just love the way that was presented. There's also this whole like underground society of talking cats in this world, and the cats are just so cat-like. I love them all. So if this book series had been focused on the etherealists and the cats, I think I would have really liked the second book. Unfortunately, it's more focused on these airships and this war that's kind of developing between these different spires. So this is a world where humans now live on spires, and the world is also covered in mist, and the mist is very dangerous, and there's all these scary creatures living in it, flying in it, or on the ground. So this was actually the second attempt that I'd made at this book as well. So I had originally tried reading the physical book from the library, but because there were so many bits focusing on things that I wasn't interested in, I decided to go to the audiobook where I could at least skip through to the bits that I did care about. But in the end, there just wasn't enough of those bits, so not my favorite. So if I'm putting these two books up against each other, I'm actually going to pick Witch King just because I feel like it had so much more potential. And in the end, when I read the story twice, I did end up feeling quite invested by the end of it. So Witch King goes through to the next round. Then for our next battle, we have Sharp Ends by Jo Abercrombie up against Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. So Sharp Ends is a short story anthology in the First Law world where there is about 10 books. I think it was published after the first trilogy, and then there's 3 more standalones. Then you get Sharp Ends before finally going into the final trilogy, which I have just started. What I will say is I was really hoping that Sharp Ends would continue to build out the world. One thing that I think the standalones has done really well is give you so many different perspectives of different characters that when you get a scene, you also know so much about all the side characters in the scene that it makes everything feel so much more full. And even though I didn't always like the standalone stories, that is something that I appreciated from them. So I was hoping to get more of that in Sharp Ends, and unfortunately I feel like most of the short stories in Sharp Ends didn't really matter, and as well, like, the stories themselves didn't really stand up as interesting stories. The only ones I really found interesting is right at the end there were a couple that were written quite creatively, and then we did also get a different perspective of Logan, or the Bloody Nine, from the first trilogy, and that was an interesting perspective, even though I'm still kind of struggling with it because I'm not exactly sure how we get from that Logan to the Logan at the start of the first trilogy. Whereas actually the very first story in Sharp Ends was one giving you a different perspective of Glockter before he had experienced any of the trauma that makes him the miserable, crippled torturer that he is in the first trilogy. Like getting to see him in his glory days, that was really interesting, but I know how he got from that to who he is in the first trilogy. Anyway, the summary is Sharp Ends was kind of pointless. Then a book that was definitely not pointless was Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the second book in the Stormlight archives, where we're kind of following a cast of characters as there's kind of a big impending danger, and as a result, magical elements are at play and people are starting to gain these different magical abilities, are all kind of in the middle of this war between these other creatures. It's a hard series to describe because each book is this thick, so there's a lot going on, but I really enjoyed my reread. So I have read the first 3 books of the Stormlight Archives before, and then because there's just so much going on in these, I decided to go back and reread the whole of the Cosmere because it's all connected. Brandon Sanderson's Bigger World is all connected into these books. So I decided to reread everything before I went into Rhythm of War, and I'm really glad that I did that because on a reread, I'm picking up so much more. This book is absolutely rereadable because, as I said, you'll pick up on so many things, and there's just things that I have no memory of from the first read that I now read and can see the importance of those things. But also on a reread, I still really enjoyed the emotional journey. It was just a really great time. I am unfortunately not going to let this win the battle though, because I don't tend to let rereads win Best Book of the Month, but if it could win, this one would win. Since it can't, I guess we'll put Sharpians through to the next round. Okay, then I have some more Brandon Sanderson books. I just feel like Brandon Sanderson is somehow taking over all my reading at the moment, but I am almost caught up on all his books. So if he can just calm down, I won't have to be filling my TBRs with him all the time. But anyway, in this battle we have books 5 and 6 of Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians by Brandon Sanderson up against 6 of Dusk by Brandon Sanderson. So firstly, the Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians books. The month before, I was doing a whole Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians series read through, and just those last 2 books ended up spilling over into March. When I did that read through, I did say that even though I was enjoying these and I felt like they were a lot of fun, I also felt like they would probably be quite forgettable. And yeah, I've forgotten a lot of the details of these books already. I still remember like the broad strokes of things. So basically this book series, we follow Alcatraz, who is an orphan and discovers that there's kind of this whole hidden world. Basically the evil librarians have been keeping all these other countries that are hidden in the oceans, been keeping those secret from everybody else, and his parents were both from that world, so he ends up kind of exploring this world and also learning about different magical talents that some people have in this world. The talents were my favorite thing about this series. Basically, everybody who has a talent has a seemingly useless talent, like they're always late, or sometimes they wake up ugly in the morning, or like there's one who's really good at tripping. But the way that those talents are used in the story in ways that are just really clever and useful was really amazing. There are also magical glasses in this world that some people can use. So like the magic was really interesting, and that's what Brandon Sanderson's always so good at, is his world building and his magic systems, and this was the same. I did feel like the emotional journey wasn't quite as good. Also, basically the 5th book is Alcatraz's ending to the story, where he basically fails at everything, and at the end of that book, Bastille, who is another character in the series, comes in and says, no, that's a terrible ending, I'm going to write the actual ending. So that's why the last book is called Bastille versus the Evil Librarians. And I did find the ending somewhat satisfying. There was a marriage at the end, which I thought was completely a waste of time. But I think my general opinion of marriages is probably quite different from Brandon's. I guess in the end, I thought the series was a lot of fun. I can definitely see the last book would have been a big struggle because the books are so humorous and there's so much wordplay through the whole thing, but that's Alcatraz's style of writing, and so it must have been really hard to write the final book from Bastille and try to get a similar tone but still keep it true to Bastille's personality, which I thought they did a really good job of. The series was just overall a lot of fun, but still, I don't know how much the story will stick with me. I think in a little while, all I'll probably remember is the talents. So then I read 6th of Dusk, which is a short little novella set on another planet in the Cosmere. Basically, Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere is just like this bigger world with all these different planets where they have different magic systems that kind of follow some bigger rules. So in the world of 6 of Dusk, we're following this trapper who goes to these islands. These islands are really dangerous. There's these different horrible monsters that track people by sensing their thoughts. But these trappers do have these birds that have the ability to like essentially shield their thoughts. So he goes to the island. It's really dangerous, and then he discovers that there's these people kind of from the mainland there doing some things that they shouldn't really be doing. Like, they shouldn't be there at all. It's far too dangerous, and what they're doing is kind of meddling with things that they don't entirely understand. It could lead to long-term progress, or could also lead to disaster. And the general theme of the story is around kind of the inevitability of progress, and the fact that progress can be good but can also not, and you tend to get both at the same time. So I really enjoyed this. Again, I thought the world building was really good. The magic was interesting. I enjoyed the character interactions and just the general tension between this trapper and the other person that he meets on this island, and just how they deal with the threats on this island. It was only a short story, but I enjoyed it. So if we're putting Six of Dust up against the last Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians books, I still would pick Six of Dust. Admittedly, I only read it the other day, but I still think it is a story that will stick with me for longer. Then lastly, we have The Dream Daughter by Diane Chamberlain up against Dark One Forgotten by Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells. Yes, I read even more Brandon Sanderson books in the month of March. But anyway, The Dream Daughter, this is a book I was hoping to really love. We basically follow this woman in the 60s, and she discovers that her unborn baby has a heart condition and there's nothing they can do. However, then her brother-in-law comes to her and says, well, actually, you could time travel to 2001 and there they would be able to do something for your baby. So that's what she does. I will admit, it takes until at least halfway through the book before anything happens that's at all different from the synopsis. And a lot of this book is really just this woman struggling with motherhood and having a sick child. And motherhood in general isn't a theme that I particularly enjoy reading about, especially not when it's like angsty motherhood troubles like a sick baby. I think for the first half of the book I just felt really anxious and awful the whole time. Then it did in the second half do some more interesting things with the time travel, which was really the main thing that I was interested in this book for, but it took a long time to get there. And as well, I just don't think it quite did as much as it could. And also actually kind of the emotional ending felt very rushed, and I was a bit unsatisfied with that. Even there was one bit that I guessed quite early on, and it ended up being like only a very brief mention in the end. Like, I was right, but she barely ever mentioned it, and I wanted more satisfaction of being right. Also, just a couple of bits that didn't entirely make sense to me, but it was very emotionally engaging, so I can see why a lot of people love this. I don't know that I can quite see why it's their favorite, but it was emotionally engaging, so if you're interested in a story about motherhood with a little bit of time travel, you'd probably like this one. Then we have Dark One Forgotten. So this is basically like an audio series, and it really has to be audio because it's told as a series of podcasts. Some bits are recorded just as a straight like podcast narration, but other bits are interviews, and some bits are like they've just been recorded live. So this is a spin-off of Brandon Sanderson's graphic novel Dark One, but I don't think you really need to have read Dark One, because I have, but I've also forgotten it pretty much, and that didn't really cause a problem. Basically in this, we're following this young music student who comes across this very successful violinist who seemed to just disappear, and then everybody forgot her for a period of time, and now she's trying to investigate what actually happened to this girl and why everybody forgot her. As I said in my blog, I really think this book is struggling to find its audience. I imagine some people would really love this, but it's not Brandon Sanderson's epic fantasy kind of crew. And some of the humor and the narration and just the characters in general come across as quite young. Like they're university students, and at times it's just like university students having fun. Sadly, university was a long time ago for me, but I still found those bits like humorous and funny. Sometimes Brandon Sanderson's humor doesn't do it for me, but in this one, it was okay. I do think as well though, right near the end when it was more like just events being recorded. It was sometimes hard to follow the action because that's kind of how they dealt with it when it was more action near the end. It was sometimes hard to really figure out what was going on, but it wasn't too bad. And I think the audiobook narrators did like an amazing job at putting it together. And when I was listening to it, I did feel really addicted with knowing what was going to happen next and like finding out the next step in solving the mystery. So if I'm putting these two books up against each other, I think I'm going to go with Dark One Forgotten, just because it was a lot more fun and like I felt engaged with both of these books, but I felt like more addicted and more obsessed with Dark One Forgotten, so I think I'll go with that one. Then lastly, let's talk about the 3 graphic novels that I read. We have The Promised Neverland Volume 17 by Kaiu, Shirai and Posuka Demizu, up against Marry My Husband by Sungsojak, up against Bug Boys by Knetzger. Okay, firstly, The Promised Neverland. This is a 20-book manga series that I started, I think, the end of last year. We're following this group of orphans. They're really cute and also really smart, but something's off about their orphanage, and when they eventually learn what's going on, they decide they need to escape. Some books in the series I really loved. In the beginning, I felt like it had that Death Note feel, where it's this battle of wits with some really clever characters. By the end, though, I just didn't feel like the logic was always making sense, and I felt like the momentum was lost and we weren't really moving forward. There were new elements being introduced, but whenever I was interested in it, we just weren't getting enough of that. Oh, actually, I think I just said 17, but I think maybe I gave up at 15. So yeah, I read this and then I decided to DNF the series because I was just so bored, and I looked up a plot summary and not much else happened in the last 5 volumes, and I just didn't care about the characters anymore. So I think I made the right call to DNF it. I'm kind of sad that it didn't do everything it could have done with some of the cool concepts that were introduced, but never mind, I guess. Then we have Marry My Husband. Basically, after I read Cursed Princess Club last month and really loved it, I decided to pick up another webtoon type thing. Goodreads actually recommended to me Marry My Husband, and I thought from the cover maybe it was going to get really dark and twisted. Basically, it is a story about this woman who is dying of cancer, and then her husband and her best friend do something really awful to her, and when she dies, though, she finds herself 10 years back in the future, and she decides to get revenge on her husband and her best friend by basically making them marry each other because they're both so awful. So that's the setup. Most of the story, though, is really just this woman having a glow up. She is doing some really vindictive things to her boyfriend at the time and also her best friend, who's kind of a bitch. She's also kind of involved with different people at her work. There is a guy, her boss actually, that, yeah, I quite like him. It's been a while since I had a fictional crush, but you know, when they're drawn as well, I think that really helps for me. But to be honest, I think, let me check how many episodes through I am. I've read 20 chapters so far. Has anything particularly mind-blowing happened? No. Is it even that dark like I was hoping? Not really. Am I still kind of addicted to scrolling through it on my phone? Yes. Yes, I am. And so I'll probably read the whole thing and then decide that was a waste of time. But it's kind of just like hearing interesting work gossip where people are being really awful to each other. And it's kind of nice just to have something to pick up when I need something to do for a minute and I don't want to get into anything longer or like more brain taxing. Then lastly, we have Bug Boys. This is just a super cute little graphic novel about these bugs. We've got Stag Bee and Rhino Bee, and they are best friends, and they're just going out and exploring the world and having adventures. And it's cute and funny and just a wholesome, good time. I will say there's one bit near the end where I'm pretty sure they accidentally touch some mushrooms or something and go on a wild drug trip, and that bit was my absolute favorite. I loved it so much. I could reread that bit many times. Nothing mind-blowing, but super cute. So if I'm putting all 3 of these against each other, obviously we're going to take out The Promised Neverland because that ended up causing me to DNF the series. And as well, I think we're going to get rid of Marry My Husband because That's nothing serious. So that means we're going to put Bug Boys through to the next round. Although actually we're going to do a couple of semi-final rounds, and I'll probably just skip Bug Boys through to the final. So semi-final rounds, firstly we have Witch King by Martha Wells up against Sharp-Ends by Jo Abercrombie. Both of these had problems. Sharp-Ends though, I just feel like I didn't need to read that. I didn't really get anything out of reading it. Witch King, I got disappointment in the way that it was structured, but some of the ideas were really cool, and like looking back on it, I can appreciate what it wanted to be. So for that reason, we're going to pick Witch King to go through to the final. Then we've got what turns out to be a Brandon Sanderson battle. So we have Sixth of Dusk up against Dark One Forgotten. Although I must remember that Dan Wells was involved in writing Dark One Forgotten as well, because I think he probably had a big influence on the final product. Anyway, if I'm putting these two up against each other, even though I had a lot of fun with Dark One Forgotten and like I read it in that addictive, obsessive way, I kind of think the ideas and the theme of Sixth of Dusk is going to sit with me for longer. And the new secret project that should be coming out next year, I think is going to be set in the same world. So for that reason, it should stick with me, or I will be revisiting this for sure in the future. Okay, so that means we're up to the final. The final is going to be Witch King by Martha Wells up against Sixth of Dusk by Brandon Sanderson, up against Bug Boys by Laura Knetzger. I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right. Okay, so for these three, firstly, we're going to take away Witch King because, as I said, I was just really disappointed with the way it was structured. I think the way the story was presented really stopped it from having its full effect, and it's just so frustrating. So we'll take that away. Then I have Bug Boys versus Sixth of Dusk. I can't really pick Bug Boys, even though I loved that one particular bit, and there were heaps of jokes that I really loved. It's just silly. It's just fun. And maybe if Sixth of Dusk wasn't as good as it would, I could still put Bug Boys first, but it's not. So we're going to take away Bug Boys, and the winner of Best Book of the Month is going to be Sixth of the Dusk. Have I said that name wrong lots of times in this video? Possibly. I keep doing it. Anyway, Sixth of the Dusk by Brandon Sanderson, Best Book of the Month. It only took me about an hour or so to read, so it's really quick if you want to give it a go. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about in this video, because I would love to talk with you more about them down in the comments, or let me know what the best book you read was in the month of March. And do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.